This video is designed to help you a little bit understand the capabilities and limitations of PowerPoint. PowerPoint's been around for a long time. It's been developed for businesses. It's used frequently in education, and there are many people who uh, think that PowerPoint is a wonderful tool, and probably the same number of folks who cannot stand PowerPoint in any form. So what I want to talk about is some of the pitfalls, some of the capabilities, some of the different ways that we can use PowerPoint to help us present what we would like to present. So I'm going to start here with a title slide, and this is probably one that you've all seen before. It's a stock background. This comes from one of the 48 or 50 or 60 or however number you get with whatever version of PowerPoint that you have. You can see it's got a fixed background, it's got a color scheme. There's a difference between the material that goes, the typeface in the title, and then the supplementary information of the subtitle uses a different typeface. Standard, you've seen this 100 times. If you haven't seen this layout, you've seen ones that are very similar. Here is exactly the same information conveyed in a little bit different form. Here, by including this Dilbert cartoon, who Dilbert, by the way, is one of my favorite cartoonists. You've seen a couple of his cartoons before in this course. It emphasizes the visual element, makes fun of the whole slide making process, and then conveys the same information in a little bit smaller space. So here, rather than emphasize text, I'm emphasizing image. I'm emphasizing a visual element, and I'm picking a particular visual element to help me tell the story that I want to tell. So I'm trying to get away here from the stock kinds of backgrounds, the stock layouts that PowerPoint has. And if you're thinking about how to put together your own slideshow for the visual argument assignment, this would be the advice that I would give you, is to focus on visuals, focus on trying to make something different rather than trying to do something predictable. A little bit of history on PowerPoint. Many years ago, when I first started doing presentations in the Army, and I used to travel all over the country talking in the mid-'80s, I did everything with 35mm slides. I had to carry a carousel with me. I had to carry a slide projector. I would also have to make my slides 3 weeks to 5 weeks ahead of time. And then once they were made, they couldn't be changed. I mean, I would draw them out, a draftsman would then turn them into something more finished. Those would be photographed and then turned into slides. And so once they were made, you couldn't change them. You could change the order, but you couldn't change the content of any slide. Times have obviously changed. This particular presentation I just redid this morning, and it's one that I've been working on off and on for years, that I've used in other versions of the course, but I update it to add new information or new ideas. So PowerPoint came along about 25 years ago or so. And there were two different programs that informed it. One was called Harvard Graphics and the other was called Freelance. Harvard Graphics did text. Lotus Freelance did graphs. I mean, it's sort of backwards when you start thinking about these things. To create a slideshow in the old days, you had to use both of these, and you printed your slides out on acetate using something called a plotter, and then you could show them. But the good thing was you could change information up until the minute that you were going to give the presentation. A third influence, Presenter, was created by a small company, and that actually was an attempt to integrate both graphics and text and charts into one production, but it didn't have very many features. But Microsoft, as they frequently do, recognized its potential and simply bought the company. Harvard Graphics and Lotus Freelance stayed on their own for a number of years, and I think they're still around, but I don't think you see too many people using them. Fundamentally, PowerPoint is so powerful, it simply has no peer competitors. One of the big advantages of PowerPoint is you can use it with Excel, you can use it with Word, you can use it with any other Microsoft product to create visual images that stick around. Some of the problems with PowerPoint, of course, as I mentioned early on, it's familiar. We've all seen it a million times. We know exactly what it's going to look like. We know what the backgrounds are. You know, we know what the layouts are going to be almost before we start. It's linear. It starts at a beginning and it ends at the end. It's hard to turn a presentation into a circle. It's hard to sometimes show the complexity of an issue because everything has to be organized, and it's organized around the idea of an outline. That's what the text-heavy versions of PowerPoint tend to do. I've already said it's familiar, but it's also predictable. You kind of know when you see one slide what's going to come next. The focus is taken away from the presenter, that is from you, and it's put onto whatever you show on the screen. The final point is that it's obscuring in the sense that it makes something very complicated actually look very simple and logical and organized. And so it tends to underwhelm rather than overwhelm. Sometimes that can be a good thing, but it makes it hard to do nuance. It makes it hard to do things where you want to have a lot of qualifications on a particular claim, for example. By the way, down here at the bottom, I put in a text box to tell you where I got this graphic from. If you do what I do, which is to go through Google Images to find graphic images to include in your presentation, you need to document that. And all you really need to do is put in a text box with the URL of the place where you got the image from. Okay. There are basically two kinds of approaches to PowerPoint, what we call the traditional approach and the radical approach. The traditional is probably what I tend to do a lot, what probably a lot of your teachers or a lot of business people tend to do, which is you make a series of slides that are too many bullets, too text heavy, you have too many slides, and all the slide presenter does is just simply read them. Okay. That's what we're used to looking at, and we have slides that end up looking pretty much like this. That is, ones that are text heavy, that are organized around bullets, and don't really convey a whole lot of information except in this long outline format. Down here on the bottom right, you'll see a slide that fits this radical idea, where you reduce the amount of text, you don't use bullets, you include photographs. If there's things, and this doesn't really apply to your presentation, although it might if you were doing it for a class, you might be able to hand out a piece of paper with a whole bunch of information on it that you don't necessarily want to put on a slide. And that puts the focus of the audience back on you as the presenter, because then they're going to listen to you and watch your slides rather than try to remember all the little data points that you've included in all the bullets. So this is, again, a radically different approach. Dark background, white letter, one photograph, no bullet, and it's a quotation rather than a series of facts. Okay, so when you're thinking about these things, think about how you can move away from the traditional approach to this radical approach. That's really where you ought to be thinking about, because that's where the power in PowerPoint comes from, is that it's a visual medium and it's best used as a visual medium. So here's two different versions of the same slide. Here's a very traditional kind of slide. Consideration for doing a PowerPoint presentation. I got to think about my audience and purpose. I got to think about the size of the room. I've got to think about what kind of tools I'm going to have available. Do I have a digital projector? Do I have overhead? If the digital projector is there, will it work with the computer that I have, or will it not? If it doesn't, do I need to bring some acetate? Blah, blah, blah. And then the third thing I need to see is what kind of stuff do I put onto a handout. So you can see here, I've got 3 major bullet points, and then I've got 2 to 4 subpoints under each of those points. This is a very traditional slide. Here's exactly the same information, and I've conveyed it in a different way. I'm still going to talk about my 3 major things: the audience, the space, and then what I'm going to put into my handouts. But I've given you a visual image that should call to mind some of the issues that are associated with doing a presentation on PowerPoint. If I do it this way, then suddenly you say, oh boy, that screen's pretty far away. It's kind of hard to see. And then you start looking here at the different laptops, and what you see is that no 2 laptops are on the same page, which tells you that the further back you are from the screen, the less likely you as an audience member are to pay attention. Okay. You can also see how the screen size is small relative to the space. And you got to think about, well, how do I make the images big enough to be seen? How do I make the text large enough to be seen in this kind of space? So the bottom line here is that this is really all about how do you look at a slide? Do I do it with text? Do I do it with an image and then talk? My sense is the second version is more attractive to an audience. They're going to see more things. They're going to be more engaged with it because it doesn't simply match their expectations. It challenges them, expands them, and gives them a concrete example of this particular room and this particular audience to get some sense of how you can make this better. There's even a piece of a handout up here on the balcony. How about that? So this kind of radical approach to slide making is something that you ought to think about. Okay, just some simple things to remember here. The less you put on a slide, the more important it is. The more that you can talk about what's on a slide rather than just read it, the better off you're going to be. Again, what you're trying to do is avoid things that are familiar, and you're trying to make your point in a way that makes sense to you. And again, here's two different versions of the same kind of slide. This is the traditional approach, some facts, a bulletized list. You know, you've all seen that a million times. This shows you the dynamic process of microfinance. We've got a lender on this side and somebody over here who's using the money to create a small business who then pays it back. So even though this slide is static, it has a sense of motion about it. If you look at this one, this is a slide that you just simply read from top to bottom. There's no motion there at all. And again, this kind of shows you the power of this radical approach. Here's some more to think about. This comes from a web visionary called Gar Reynolds, who's famous for his work on making PowerPoint better. If you just type Gar Reynolds into Google, you'll find all kinds of websites that talk about him and talk about his work. And I haven't put any into Blackboard because they change so much. But here we've got this particular slide, old-fashioned, clip art, lots of bullets. Here's a slide where we've got a real human being that he's done some editing with, and he's talked about using Photoshop here, but there are actually some of these things you can actually do in PowerPoint if you want to spend some time on it. But if you pick the right image, you don't necessarily have to blur it this way. But he's reduced the number of points to the most important. He's not going through a laundry list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Instead, he's just got 4. Okay. Down here, you can see two other slides that can be helpful. This would be a good slide because it focuses on the person. This particular figure, Ken Sakamoto, who's CEO of an organization. You can see how he doesn't take up the whole slide, but he takes up a fair amount of it. He's the only visual here on the page, and so that emphasizes him. Here is another slide that I would argue looks good, but if you look at this content, you suddenly realize there's really not much there. But again, the whole point of this thing is to stay away from the slide in the upper left-hand corner and move more to the other 3 slides that you see here. And again, this emphasizes the visual primacy that PowerPoint allows you to have. Okay. Something to think about with color. And color is something, you're going to be doing a presentation that's going to be viewed online, so color is easy. Black and white is actually harder to see online. But one of the interesting things to think about color is that the warmer the color, like these reds and browns up here, the more immediate, the closer they are. These circles, interestingly enough, are all the same size, but this is an optical illusion because cooler colors tend to fade into the background, warmer colors tend to push themselves forward. So when you're looking at color, think about that. Use colors that force themselves out to an audience. Stay away from what a lot of my students do, which is a blue background and white letters. How boring. Okay. Another point here is the idea of using a real photograph, even if it's a stock photograph, rather than a piece of clip art or just an outline drawing like this, like a silhouette. Here we have a real person. We can see a real woman here who has, you know, certain facial features and hair colors and things. It's not just some thing that we see over here that we think is a woman. We can see the subject that she's working on. We can see what she's holding in her hand. We can see where she's sitting. She is just visually more interesting than this. So when you're thinking about putting your slides together, think about using photographs rather than clip art. How do you start putting a slideshow together? One of the ways to think about it is to go to the outline view, which I think maybe 5 students out of 100 have ever heard of, and just start typing out your bullets. That's what I've done here. This is the slideshow that you're looking at. What I've done here is I'm showing you what the text looks like, and you can suddenly see just how much you have. And once you see that, you can start to say, well, can I take any of this out? How much of this can I take away? What can I move around? And the nice thing about working in outline view is you can take bullets off of one slide, insert a new slide, and put those bullets on that slide. There's all kinds of different things you can do in outline, and you'll be able to see your presentation as a whole. And as you can see, I've got a lot of different slides in here that have no text at all, and we'll be looking at some of those because they're very image heavy. Okay, but outline view can be a really helpful tool for you. I want to talk a little bit about proportions. We talk about this thing called the divine proportion, 1 to 1.618 or 1.7. And the idea is that height and width are balanced, that height and width have a proportionality that you ought to keep. PowerPoint, interestingly enough, does this automatically. If you use a title and then you go to a bullet and then a sub-bullet, it's going to adjust the size of those typefaces proportionally to match this 1 to 1.7 ratio, so that your title is going to be 1.7 times bigger than the bullet underneath it. The sub-bullet will be 1.7 times the sub-bullet underneath that. And if you ever wondered how they come up with these ratios, move from like 48 to 36 to 24, it's all based on this idea of divine proportion. And again, you can see kind of the difference. These letters are, if we could assign a value of 1 to the height of these letters, this is a 1.7 times bigger version of it. And you can see how kind of pleasing that is. The second thing to think about is this thing called the rule of thirds. If you can imagine a slide or a visual of any kind, you can divide it up into 9 rectangles. Why do we want to do this? Because our eye naturally focuses on the intersection of these 4 places. So when you're putting your slide together, think about, instead of balancing it from the top to the bottom, organizing it around the middle and moving out. If you go back to those photograph slides that we were looking at for that CEO, you're going to find that 2/3 of the slide is empty, 1/3 of the slide is his photograph. Why is that? Because it takes our natural inclination to look over here and forces us to look that way. You don't have to put your most important thing dead center. I'm not saying that. But you got to think about the balance. You got to think about where things go. What we tend to do, like I said, is we tend to look here first, and then we start moving our way around. In some cultures, we go from left to right. In other cultures, we go from right to left, depending on how we learn to read. But always think of your slide as not just a top to bottom thing, but rather a whole that people are going to view from the middle and then out. Okay. This 1 to 1.7 ratio, we've been doing it for years. It's the basis of a credit card. Why do credit cards look like this? When I was a kid, credit cards were all kinds of different sizes. My mom had different ones. Some were square, some were skinny, like half the height of this one. Some were more or less the size of this. There was no standardization. But when MasterCard came along, they standardized it. Actually, Diners Club, I should say, was the very first credit card that developed this shape and size. Why? Because the proportions are pleasing and it's easy to hold in the hand. You want to hold on to it. You want to use it because it feels good. Why does it feel good? Because of its proportionality. Okay. There's all kinds of other things. Why do you guys always like to play with your phones? Why do you like to hold on to one? It's because a phone is proportional. A phone is 1 to 1.7 by and large. There are some exceptions to this, but that's basically the ratio that they work in. We want to hold on to these things because of that proportionality, because that's what they feel like in our hand. They make us feel good when we hold on to them. Here are some other things in your life that you may not realize are proportionality. Where proportionality is important. The iPod is one of the classics of these. This is a 1 to 1.7 ratio. The iPod Shuffle, you may wonder why that's the size that it is, partly to accommodate the different chips that are inside of it, but partly because they wanted to create something that reflected this proportionality. It's a 1 to 1.59. Here are a couple of schematic things that illustrate this proportionality. Again, what's this important? Why is this important? Because when you're putting your images into your presentation, you might want to think about proportionality. You might want to think about, how do I make this image more pleasing to the eye? Okay. Where does this come from? It comes from the human body. Okay. 1 to 1.7. 1 to 1.7. 1, yeah, 1 to 1.7. So you can kind of see how this works. When we respond to somebody, we say, oh, that's a very handsome man or a good-looking woman. Many times it's because of the proportionality of their face, not necessarily the individual elements, the eye color, the hair color, the shape of the mouth or something. But it's more to the case that it's the proportionality that we're focusing on. So it's a really important thing to think about. Most of the reason that we like something or don't like something visually has to do with its proportionality. You can look at a house sometimes and say, ooh, that's not that house doesn't do it for me. Well, why? Normally because it's disproportional. Something is out of whack. The elevation is too high for the width. The front porch isn't proportional to the rest of the house, and so on. So these are the kind of things in our daily lives that we don't notice, but we should, because that's what makes something pleasing, what makes something attractive. And so when you're putting your slides together, again, think about proportionality. Think about how much space you're going to devote to one thing over another, and keep that 1 to 1.7 ratio in mind. Okay, this is the last slide. PowerPoint is a lot of trouble to go to, and there are different places to go for help. If you click on the slides that are in Blackboard, that are separate from this presentation, you can go to these different places, and they'll help you find things that can help you put your presentation together. One I want to point out here is something called SlideShare. I hope it loads. SlideShare is like YouTube for PowerPoint. It is an enormous database of slides. Anybody can post anything there. So you get slides from businesses, you get slides from elementary school students, you get slides from all kinds of educational institutions and corporations, and they just dump them here. Okay, you can use their backgrounds, you can use their graphics, as long as you document where it came from, where you can say, okay, well, I got these slides, this formatting from this SlideShare presentation. You just put that at the bottom of the page on the first slide, or you put it into the works cited page, and you tell where your format and layout comes from. As long as you change the content, you'll be fine. I did have one student, this will be the last thing I tell you, that made a mistake one year, got behind, did a presentation where he got everything from SlideShare, the entire presentation. And I caught it because the slideshow that he put together had nothing to do with his argument papers, on a completely different topic. And I noticed it, and I said, why did you do this? And he said, oh, I thought this is what you wanted. And I said, nope, this thing is taken from someplace else. And he ended up failing the course, partly because he didn't complete all the assignments and partly for plagiarism. So make sure that when you take something from SlideShare, if you decide to use it, that you document it. That's the first thing. The second thing is, don't take their content. You can take their format, you can take their layout, you can take their graphics, but you cannot take their information. The information has to come from your argument paper and from your own research that you've done subsequent to putting it together. I can't emphasize that enough. Well, I hope this is helpful. I'm looking forward to your presentations. Don't forget that it's a 3-part assignment: the presentation, an explanation of that presentation, and then an evaluation of your other group members' presentations as well. And let me know if you have any questions.